Tonight, World in Action uncovers the sinister world of Combat 18. Late last year, people all over England began getting death threats. Some claim to be from the Ku Klux Klan.
We have got your location and where you live, and we will be watching you, and we're going to take you out. It's as simple as that. You're nothing but a Jewish slag. You'll be taken out by the Ku Klux Klan. Just let her know that Combat 18 have got her eye on her. We're going to take her out.
In a picturesque corner of Norfolk, Alison Loughlin runs a guest house. It's a retreat for people wanting a break from city life. Last year, she donated a weekend here as a prize in a raffle for the anti-apartheid movement. This innocent gesture led to a frightening telephone encounter.
He said, have you ever had anyone from the anti-apartheid movement? And I said, yes, I have. I was happy to receive some people who'd run the raffle prize. I said, in what connection do you ask? And he said, oh, well, we've heard that you had those people, and we don't like that, and we're going to make... and I said, well, I'm not sure that you've really got the right impression about this. And he said, oh, yes, we've certainly got the impression about what you're doing, and we don't like it, and we're going to be making a very nasty impression on you. And I said, well, can you just tell me who I'm talking to? He said, it's a member of the British Ku Klux Klan.
Another victim was Cheshire holiday operator Martin Vasey. Like Alison Loughlin, his generosity had made him a target.
We received a call that came on our answer phone one Friday night. A person describing himself as from the British Ku Klux Klan. He said that it had come to his notice that we'd offered a prize to the anti-apartheid movement for a fun run that they were doing down in London. And he said as a result of that, he wasn't very happy about it and the offices would be attacked. We wondered whether it was a bit of a prank, a bit of a joke, but it was true that we had given this prize. So the person obviously knew about that, and we took it seriously enough to contact the local police.
I felt distinctly vulnerable, really. I thought, well, is something going to happen immediately? How shall I know? Do I go on trusting people? Do I lift up the phone?
Martin Vasey and Alison Loughlin and the many other victims of similar threats had no way of knowing they'd been targeted by an extremist group called Combat 18. Nor did they know it was already engaged in physical attacks on people it saw as its enemies.
Combat 18 could be described as an organisation participating in political terrorism, viewed in the context of threats of violence and carrying out that violence.
Combat 18 is thought to have about 70 active members. It takes its name from the first and 8th letters of the alphabet, the initials of Adolf Hitler.
It believes in organising itself on a cell structure, not a mass political movement, and it believes there is a certain amount of security in following a cell structure, so that infiltration by the police or security organisations is limited to the persons involved in a particular cell.
Combat 18's hit lists appear in its members-only bulletin called Red Watch. Copies obtained by World in Action reveal that scores of people have been targeted. They also reveal why. Combat 18 is a fanatical neo-Nazi group whose intended victims are usually Jews or its political opponents. Several MPs are singled out for harassment.
These publications have been called hit lists. Is that fair?
I think that's a very fair description, because what other interpretation can one place on a list of names and addresses circulated to members? It must be for the purpose of at least harassment.
And at worst?
And at worst, severe physical attack.
March the 27th at a bookshop in East London. The quiet of a normal Saturday is about to be shattered.
They were wearing hoods with slits showing only their eyes. They had carved and painted wooden clubs.
Freedom Press, a small radical publishers for over 100 years, had become the latest victim of Combat 18. The cell carrying out the attack worked with clinical efficiency.
But within a couple of minutes, and this happened very quickly, within 2 or 3 minutes, they smashed anything to do with typesetting. There's a computer typesetting machine, and another machine which is a laser jet printer, They smashed that with their clubs and then went straight off out. Definitely this was with military precision. Yes, these people knew what they were doing.
Before they left, the raiding party left a calling card. Above a door they sprayed C-18. Until now, little has been known about Combat 18. Its Red Watch hit list was seen only by its own members. The rare copies which leaked out gave only a post office box address in America. But that address is a clue to the shadowy figure behind Combat 18. Greensboro, North Carolina in the United States. In November 1979, right-wing fanatics attack a demonstration against the Ku Klux Klan. They produce guns and they open fire. They kill 5 people. It became known as the Greensboro Massacre. Pulling the triggers were members of several Ku Klux Klan and Nazi groups. One of their leaders, though he was not present at the shootings, was a veteran Nazi called Harold Covington. The American address given on C-18's Red Watch hit lists is Covington's own P.O. box in North Carolina. Dixie Press is his publishing company, also based in North Carolina. Red Watch describes how any information about potential targets is to be sent to the Dixie Press address, and
our brothers in America will then redirect any correspondence back to our safe address here in England.
And in Red Watch, Combat 18 thanks Big H in North Carolina for his help. Tried before an all-white Southern jury, all the Greensboro gunmen were acquitted. But interviewed even as his men stood trial, Covington had no regrets about what had happened.
I do not give a happy damn about their human rights or anything else. They got what they deserved.
You show no remorse toward the families or the victims?
One shouldn't show remorse for stamping on a rattlesnake.
And even then, Covington was talking about a new approach for his followers.
We've got a whole new plan, a whole new method of operating that we're going to initiate. It's a response to the fact that the government has tried to kill us here 4 times in the past 18 months. And it involves putting the party on a semi-underground status, but it also involves a whole new tactical direction for the movement.
Harold Covington no longer appears in his stormtrooper's uniform, but he's still an active Nazi. And today he's putting into action his plan to build an underground Nazi movement. In his own newsletter, Resistance, he describes how he's setting up a network of cells across the world. One of those cells is Combat 18. Covington is much more than just Combat 18's postman. Last year, after shaving off his characteristic beard, he was staying secretly in Britain. Here he linked up with British Nazis to set up Combat 18. Travelling on an Irish passport, obtained when he married an Irish woman, he spent last summer in this house in East London. When his cover was blown, he abandoned the house and fled. He hasn't been seen in public since. He was in Britain at exactly the time that Combat 18's campaign of death threats began.
It's very significant that Covington is involved. He's not just another loony right-winger attracted by the fantasy of Nazi uniforms or Ku Klux Klan. He's a man with a long history of involvement in violent activity. It gives him the experience of organising on a clandestine basis. It gives him the experience of the use of violence and how to target your enemies, how to collect information on your enemies, which is what his organisation was doing in America in the 70s. Covington is trying to build a clandestine neo-Nazi organisation dedicated to violent activity, as he did in America.
Earlier this year, one C-18 member broke ranks. We'll call him Simon. Alarmed at what he was getting into, he contacted World in Action. He told us what C-18 was set up to do, and how it does it. To protect his identity, we've used an actor. But these are Simon's exact words.
Well, basically, we're talking about political terror. People on the far right have always said that too much time was spent talking about things and what was needed was action. When the opposition to the far right got organised and there was a real call for it, and the people involved just decided to put something together and basically give the right-wing punters what they wanted, which is Red's heads being cracked.
And soon heads were being cracked. World in Action has established that at least 2 serious gang attacks last year where people were badly injured, was secretly planned and carried out by Combat 18. Tim Heppell was a senior member of the British National Party, Britain's biggest extreme right party, and worked at their headquarters. But the BNP didn't know he was an infiltrator, spying for their anti-fascist opponents. In February last year, he was recruited by C-18 to join an attack on peaceful anti-Nazi campaigners in East London.
We knew where they were going to be. We knew where they were going to meet because they put their posters up all around this area and also in South London. So we walked out of the pub, and the group that I was with was a skinhead group, about 15 of us. And as we saw the leafleters, as we approached them, there was a skip full of bricks and bottles, and we armed ourselves with the bricks and bottles and basically charged into them. And they didn't know we were going to hit them until the last minute.
I think they actually caught me before I actually made the floor, and there was quite a few around me, and when I eventually fell onto the mattress and onto the floor, and I saw this one lump of concrete that was being held in two hands coming down towards my face. I immediately turned away and tried to bury my head. Unfortunately, it hit me in the back of the head and split my head open. Later, I was told by the police officers that actually came and rescued me almost from the situation, that they had been throwing half-house bricks at me while I was laying on the floor as well.
Police hadn't turned up. He might have been kicked so badly unconscious he might never have woken up. I mean, I saw his head all open and all blood coming out of the back of it. It was disgusting. And he was sort of like whimpering, you know. And also there was the shock because he didn't see it coming, you know, just straight on the back of his head.
World in Action's defector, Simon, was involved in another gang attack organised by Combat 18. It took place last August at Brick Lane, in the heart of East London's Bengali community. Anti-Nazi League members were campaigning against a British National Party candidate in a local council election.
We decided we was going to teach these people a lesson not to come down Brick Lane when we're there, and to let all the Reds know that we aren't going to take any shit. We made our way down the back of the market, went to the shops. We got Lucozade bottles of milk, change to throw in their faces, picked up stones off the ground, bricks in our pockets, and then made our way down to the paper sale. They didn't seem too bothered at first. They seemed to think they were dealing with the usual shouting and slagging match that there is sometimes between us. But then it just went. We just ploughed into it. There was bricks on them, bottles. We hit everybody we could, turned their stall over, just kicked them senseless, really. The one particular bloke took it very badly in the head, and his girlfriend laid on top of it, but they didn't stop there. But everybody just kick in, used bottles, bricks.
I was struck over the back of the head with an iron bar, and then as I turned, I was smashed over the head with a bottle. I think I must have momentarily lost consciousness then, because the next thing I knew I was lying in the middle of the street, and there was about 5 of them kicking me to the head and to the groin, and there's 2 of them standing on my ankles to prevent me rolling into a fetal position.
The locals couldn't believe it, and they've seen a lot of things in Brick Lane. They've seen a lot of violence, but they've never seen anything like that before. Everyone was surprised at the ferocity of the attack.
Later, Red Watch, C-18's members-only newsletter, was to boast about this attack.
A Combat 18 unit of 10 men and 3 members of the NF set out to confront them. With no police or local package there to help them, the ANL got battered.
World in Action has identified the men who run Combat 18. Charlie Sargent from South London is its main organiser. He's a secretive man, and even many of his Combat 18 comrades don't know where he lives. He has criminal convictions for drug smuggling and offensive weapons.
Charlie Sargent's known as the Pig. He's a bit of an animal. He loves violence. He's a knife merchant. He loves knives. He'd stab anyone. He'd stab me or anybody he worked with. If you crossed Charlie Sargent or grassed, then Charlie Sargent would have you seen to. And if he was close enough, he'd do it himself. In C-18, he's the main organiser. He gives out orders, recruits people. He's the man.
Running C-18 with Sargent is Eddie Wicker, also from South London. He's been involved with extremist groups for many years.
Eddie Wicker's a bit different. He's the daddy. He's the one everybody looks up to. Running C-18, he's getting at what he sees as his natural enemy, which is the IRA, immigrants, left-wing politicians, all the people that have always got on Eddie Wicker's nerves.
Combat 18 surfaced publicly for the first time last year. They appeared as a security force, vetting the audience at 2 right-wing meetings which claimed that Hitler's Holocaust against the Jews never took place. Next, only a day after their brutal attack at Brick Lane, they joined these British National Party members to support the BNP's council candidate in the Brick Lane area. But the most shameful episode came in November, at a memorial march for a young Asian boy who'd been murdered in Eltham, South London. His family and friends organised the march to mourn his death. Combat 18 and dozens of other right-wingers came to mock and scream abuse.
Keep the march going. Thank you very much. Keep moving, folks.
But Combat 18 took a turn towards terrorism when they escalated their campaign against political opponents. In Birmingham, the Democratic Left, formerly the Communist Party, has a bookshop. Shortly after its address was included in a C-18 Red Watch bulletin, arsonists struck.
They'd broken the glass on the side and poured petrol through the mesh. That had ignited the books and literature that were in the window, and unfortunately for us, we understand that somebody had discovered them doing this, and possibly meant that they didn't carry through as much as they were intending on doing. There could have been quite a serious fire, and we are in a building which is a multi-storey building, very considerable size, and there could have been potentially a very major disaster.
Also targeted for attack by Combat 18 were the London offices of the communist newspaper The Morning Star. It was a Saturday night when arsonists poured petrol through the door and set fire to it.
It set fire to the mat inside the doorway and started to ignite the wall there. Very fortunately, we had friends of the paper sleeping in the building at the time because we had just suffered a series of robberies. They found it almost immediately, extinguished it, and telephoned the fire brigade and the police.
That same night, the word C-18 was spray-painted on the Morning Star building. The Morning Star's own report of the attack was later reproduced in C-18's Red Watch. Alongside the press cutting, they wrote Combat 18. One thing which Combat 18 does not advertise, even in the pages of Red Watch, is its close connection with the Ulster Defence Association, loyalist terrorists in Northern Ireland.
All the leadership, the top people, what you might call the generals of C-18, are known UDA members. They're in close contact with the commander of the UDA. They organise and run socials, provide security for visiting loyalists in this country. I've been party to lots of conversations with C-18 leaders in a capacity as C-18 leaders and as UDA men.
Combat 18 is involved in a race war and seeks to single out blacks, Afro-Caribbeans, Asians, Irish, Jews. The UDA have the know-how to spread terror if that link is made specific and direct.
Last summer, the British government banned the UDA in Northern Ireland.
It is actively and primarily engaged in the commission of criminal terrorist acts. In particular, the Ulster Freedom Fighters comprise no more than a cover name for the violent acts of UDA members.
But the ban didn't stop the UDA killers. Calling themselves the Ulster Freedom Fighters, they stepped up their assassination campaign, murdering 14 people this year alone. Most of their victims were innocent Catholics, targeted simply because they were the wrong religion.
I think the violent Nazis preaching a race war, wanting to get hold of guns and ammunition and terrorist know-how, would seek that sort of connection. The surprising thing is the UDA tying up with them rather than the neo-Nazi groups tying up with the UDA.
The UDA is still legal in England, and there is no evidence to suggest that C-18 members like Charlie Sargent or Eddie Wicker have ever been involved in UDA terrorism, even though the links between the two organisations are close.
Eddie Wicker's very secretive. His function is, well, he's the UDA man. I'd say he's a courier between the two. He's a regular visitor to Belfast, and over in Belfast, he's well liked and respected. When you're invited to join C-18, that's it. Then you're no longer doing things at a British National Party or National Front. You're doing things that have the blessing, because of who's running it, of the UDA.
World in Action's evidence about Combat 18 is now to be considered by a House of Commons Select Committee.
The Home Affairs Select Committee has been concerned over a number of years about racial attacks. What we now have is some evidence of a coordinated attempt to encourage racial attacks, and the Home Affairs Select Committee is going to be very interested in that evidence, and if we find that there is that sort of coordination, we are going to be making some very strong recommendations to the Home Secretary for effective action against it.
This is not a political organisation where you might be able to argue one way or the other about the democratic right to engage in the political process. We're talking about a criminal conspiracy, and it's up to the police to take action and prevent them engaging in this sort of activity.
Organised in cells, using only an American address, Combat 18 has so far operated in secrecy, until tonight.
I'd like to ask you some questions about Combat 18 and the UDA.
I don't know what you're talking about. All right? They're piss off out of it.
Mr. Sergeant, we're from World in Action. We'd like to ask you some questions about Combat 18, if that's all right. Yeah. We'd like to ask you about these Red Watch bulletins, which you produce. Which Combat 18 produces. You're the leader of Combat 18. They're nothing more than hit lists, really, aren't they? I know. Where are they publishing? They're published in America. Why do you use an American address, Mr. Sergeant? What have you got to hide? What have you got to hide, Mr. Sergeant?
Yeah, why?
Why do you use an American address?
I don't use it. Is it my address?
It's not your address. Why don't you use your own address, Mr. Sergeant? Why do you use an American address?
You push it.
Now, Mr. Sergeant, please, we're not causing any trouble.
Well, yeah, what's he hit me for it?
He's not hitting you. You attack on camera. Use an American address. You sell UDA magazines?
Yeah, no, I sell LPA magazines.
The Loyalist Prisoners Association,
right, yeah.
Which was set up by the UDA.
Well, I don't know who it was set up by.
Yes, you do, Mr. Wicker. It was set up by the UDA, and you know it because you're a member of the UDA.
Well, what is there a law against that or something?
Tell us about the arson attack on the Morning Star that Combat 18 carried out. Did you order that attack, Mr. Sergeant?
Yeah.
You did?
Did I?
You did. You just said yes.
I said yeah, did I? I did say
The attack on Freedom Books the weekend before last, Mr. Sergeant. Did you organise that one?
Did I? You tell me.
Tell me you do not support the UDA.
No, look, there's no comment on that. No comment on it.
Because you do support them, in fact.
Well, that's beside the point. Whether I support them or not.
No, it's an important point whether you support a terrorist organisation.
But I don't class them as a terrorist organisation.
But you support them.
Eh?
But you support them.
If it come down to it, yeah, I would support them.
You would support. Do you like to tell us about your relationship with Covington?
Yeah, you pay me.
What's your relationship with Harold Covington?
You pay me.
So there is a relationship.
Is it? You pay me, and I'll tell you.
What they do is they kill Catholics. Do you support that?
There's no comment on that.
What about your relationship with the UDA? Would you like to tell us about your relationship with the UDA, Mr. Sergeant?
Yeah, what about the UDA?
About your relationship with the... Would you like to tell us about it? About the joint activities between C-18 and the UDA?
Yeah.
Would you like to tell us about...
Put it in your head, this one's going to happen. Put it in your head, this one's going to happen.
Again brought to its knees by violence. Amongst the thugs, more sinister elements are now at work. The dark forces of racism and fascism. Now they're seeking to take violence from the terraces and turn it on ordinary people. Meet Charlie Sargent. He runs a right-wing terror organisation. Their victims include women, teachers and pensioners. Meet his right-hand man, Will Browning. He's known as Wilf the Beast. His task is to recruit political terrorists from the terraces. Tonight, World in Action investigates the explosive mix of fascism and football, and exposes the brutal men who boast that the nightmare returns.
And this is a disgrace. It is a scandal. It should never have happened.
Dublin, 16th of February 1995. A friendly international football match between Ireland and England.
And you can just see all sorts of things raining over. People from here scattered now over the barriers here for their own safety. There was a lot of injuries, adults injured, belts of steel and wood. And in particular, one of our own cameramen here had a fractured skull and spent 2 weeks in hospital, you know.
Scenes at Lansdowne Road recall the horrific football violence of a decade ago. But this time, there was a difference, a new and sinister political edge.
But I think a small hardcore, probably no more than 50 at most, were instrumental in using that game to prove a political point.
I could see one guy in the top tier of the stand, he seemed to have a red overalls, and he was producing a C1A flag. It wasn't something that was draped over like the Union Jacks and so. It was something that was just getting produced in sports. And he seemed to be, you know, making signs down below, and everything seemed to revolve around him on the top tier, you know.
C18 are the initials of Combat 18. They were originally set up as security for far-right groups, but now have a life of their own. The name is taken from the first and 8th letters of the alphabet, the initials of Adolf Hitler, and it reflects the group's Nazi politics.
What about your relationship with the UDA? Would you like to tell us about your relationship with the UDA, Mr. Sargent?
World in Action first exposed Charlie Sargent, the man behind Combat 18, 2 years ago. Since then, he and his organisation have waged their campaign of terror unchecked and with increasing ferocity.
Would you like to tell us about... Put it in your way, this one's going.
Their agenda is racial violence. They attack physically members of the Asian community, the black community, members of the Jewish community. They incite violence through their actions and through their publications.
These publications list scores of innocent people as legitimate targets. Phone calls are a favourite method of intimidation.
Just let her know that Combat 18 have got on her. We're going to take her out, and we'll be watching you.
Across the country, a series of vicious attacks demonstrates the willingness of Combat 18 to carry out its threats of violence. Ian MacDonald is a bus driver. As secretary of Leeds Trades Union Council, he complained about racism in the workplace.
I had a telephone call early hours of one morning in July from an organisation called Combat 18 that said they were going to come round and see me. 2 weeks later, it happened. They came round at 2:45 on a Sunday morning. There was my wife and her lad in the house, all asleep. I was in the bedroom at the rear of the house. I heard glass smashing, turned a light on. The immediate reaction was one of fear. I went downstairs to find that my patio doors, my back door and side window had been smashed through. A week after the attack, they rang me to ask if I'd learnt my lesson.
Like many of Combat 18's victims, Ian MacDonald lives constantly with the threat of further attacks.
I'm always vulnerable. I drive buses for a living, which means I'm out driving a bus by myself 5-6 days in the week. I'm always vulnerable to such attacks. But again, I cannot let anyone intimidate me on my principles and my beliefs.
The most recent Combat 18 magazine has stepped up the call to terror. It gives details of bomb making and gun training. The hardcore of Combat 18 talk of exterminating Jews and creating a race war. But it's nationalism and a basic call to violence that they use to gain wider support.
In the last year, 18 months, they've moved into a more violent mode of conduct, especially through football violence. Their contacts within football clubs are quite extensive, And for them, the promotion of violence at football matches is a way of gaining adherence and strength.
Information from inside the shadowy world of Combat 18 is hard to come by. But one of their members, disturbed by their increasingly indiscriminate violence, has broken ranks to talk about their involvement in football. We've used an actor to represent his words.
Yeah. We look to football hooligans to recruit. Combat 18 has links with a number of firms. Hooligans are whites, and they're proud of their country just like we are. And we can give them the opportunity of a good off against niggers, IRA supporters and Reds.
I think they're more organised, I think they're more cunning, much more devious than they ever were. I think the problem is they probably put their message across better to some of the youngsters who follow football, and certain parts of their politics I can see may well be attractive to some of the younger elements who follow football.
The England World Cup qualifying matches in 1993 provided an opportunity for the move into football.
During the summer of 1993, Charlie and a few of the C18 inner core met with some of the top boys from a number of crews, like Chelsea, Arsenal, Millwall, Portsmouth and Oxford. We've been able to take some of the top boys from these firms into our other activities. None of this leafleting nonsense, but to deal with our opponents.
In Oslo, Combat 18 members were at the centre of the trouble which started in the Polite bar. The next game was in Rotterdam, and Combat 18 boasted in their magazine of their success in causing violence.
C18 managed to send a 50-strong expeditionary force to Holland, and despite hassle from the Dutch old bill, they still managed to whip up enough trouble wherever they went. C18 football fans can add this to their list of results. Well done, lads.
The opportunity for organised violence is not the only thing that attracts hooligans to Combat 18.
The one thing we do find that runs through the football scene is the violently anti-Irish feeling. The one chant we hear when England play abroad, when the domestic teams play abroad, is the no surrender to the IRA.
Ireland, an anti-IRA, is always good for us, because the leading boys are loyal to their country, and so are sick of seeing our boys being killed by the IRA. There was a pro-Ireland march in London the other year. There were hundreds of us, all the main firms. That's the way Charlie would like us to develop.
Combat 18 has always had strong links with loyalist terrorists. They've used this hard man reputation to gain status among football hooligans.
We have video evidence of certain well-known football hooligans from around the UK gathering in public houses along the march route, giving the Nazi salute through the windows as the march has gone past.
Amongst this gang from the Chelsea headhunters firm are leading members of C18. Last year, they linked up again to launch an attack on an Irish pub in London. Combat 18 boasted of it in their magazine, The Order.
A group of 80 nationalist and loyalist Chelsea fans attacked the Old Bell pub in Kilburn Iro, smashing windows and pelting the terrified Troops Out demonstrators inside the pub with bottles and bricks.
We were expecting something, you know, because it was in the wind that something might happen, you know. But it did happen. Brick came through the window and the whole glass smashed all over the place. I was watching the door and they burst in. About 6, I'd say. And they said, "Come on, you Irish bastards." And they started firing stools behind the bar. They smashed all the optics. And then I think they were going to start in the customers.
Combat 18's efforts over the last 18 months paid off with their biggest success to date in Dublin. The anti-Irish feelings of a large number of hooligans were exploited by Combat 18 organisers.
Combat 18 is not an exclusive club, and it's not the sort of thing that you join. I think a lot of people who went to Ireland joined the so-called Combat 18 banner They were there for the day just to prove their political point for that day.
So we have to remember that they are a small group, but a small group can do a lot of damage. Their influence is much more widespread, and if they can incite violence through much larger crowds, then they do become a real problem.
Lansdowne Road, like every other England international, saw the coming together of scores of different firms from all over the country.
Well, your firms are like segregated. You've got your runners, and these are well known through the country. You've got firms like Leicester Baby Squad, Nottingham Forest Executive Crew. They're your slashers. They use weapons and scarcers. They hide behind the police mouth off. Then you've got your Cockneys. There's only one firm really, that's Chelsea.
Chelsea's firm, the Headhunters, has strong links with Combat 18, stretching back over many years.
Some of our top boys were leading faces in a number of crews, particularly the Chelsea Headhunters. Charlie, although an Arsenal fan, used to run with the Chelsea Headhunters in the 80s. You see, he was best mates with Chubby, who was one of the Headhunters' top boys. He was also a London skin, and they were Chelsea.
But Combat 18's connections with the Headhunters go deeper than friendship. This season, Chelsea hooligans have again been heavily involved in violence. And for Combat 18, a campaign of intimidation started on the first day of the season when they went down to Chelsea looking for trouble. They soon found it when they came across an anti-Nazi poster in a street near the ground.
My neighbours told me that the Chelsea football matches will be starting and that when they do, I'd be wise to take the poster down.
She found out why when she was visited by 4 Chelsea Headhunters. One of them was Charlie Sargent's brother, Steve Sargent.
I heard a banging on the window and on the front door. I went out in a storm and opened the door, and there was 4 men standing on my doorstep. And they told me that if I didn't take my poster down by that later on that day, then I'd have all my windows done in and I'll be done in as well.
Fortunately for Susan O'Rourke, Steve Sargent was arrested before he could carry out his threats. Members of the Chelsea Independent Supporters Association were not so lucky. These Chelsea fans had taken a stand against racism.
They're a great bunch of lads. They're all friendly, they all get on with each other. There's never no arguments or disruptions or anything like that. Basically, you couldn't wish for a better bunch of football supporters, you know.
But Combat 18 were determined to stamp out the opposition to their racist views. In the Finborough Arms, they launched a savage attack on the independent supporters, an attack which put 4 people in hospital.
5 o'clock, jam solid, absolute jam solid. I can't let anyone in. The next thing, some chappie come out to me and he said to me, I think you better go up to the pool table, Abner. I think there's going to be, you know, a disturbance up there. It was like a tidal wave coming towards me. I mean, it was something that I have never, ever seen in my life before, and I never want to see it again. There were women screaming, kids screaming, glasses, bottles, pool cues, pool balls, tables, chairs, everything just flying all over the place. And all you could hear within the screams and such like was Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil.
These scumbags really got a taste of white power as they were systematically smashed with tables and cut with beer glasses and basically kicked the signal was given and we left the pub to a chorus of Chelsea C18, Chelsea C18.
The man behind this attack was Chelsea Headhunter and Combat 18 member Mark Atkinson. It was not to be his last attack on the Chelsea independent supporters. This season was Chelsea's first in Europe for 23 years. C18 took the opportunity to try and increase support amongst Chelsea's right-wing fans.
It's easier to operate abroad. The filth ain't watching us over there. When Chelsea played in the Czech Republic, we took a crew of about 50 out. On the way over, we stopped at a concentration camp and basically just pissed about.
They later published the pictures of their visit in their magazine, with an article claiming the atrocities never took place. But it was at Chelsea's game watched by the Czech police, that Combat 18 made its biggest show of strength.
They were standing in the middle of the, outside the gates, with their flags up. They had a sort of small circle, small posse of other fans around them. They looked pretty heavy.
After the match, Combat 18 made another attack on a member of the Chelsea Independent supporters.
They leapt onto the coach, up the steps, and the first one punched him really hard in the head, in the forehead. He sat down again, and the guy behind him raised his fist, and in it he had some kind of spike. It's about 3 inches long. It looked, from where I was sitting, like an electrical screwdriver, and tried to stab him. Came down very, very fast. He missed, luckily. If it had hit him in a vital spot, like in his head or his neck or something like that, it would have killed him.
They might have survived that assassination attempt, but their luck's going to run out sooner than they think. And Chelsea will be cleansed of this piece of shit and all the other so-called anti-fascists.
And they started thumping on the windows of the coach. They then, as we drove off, raised their black wind cheaters to reveal Combat 18 shirts.
C18 member and Chelsea headhunter Atkinson was again involved. But here, he had an even more frightening accomplice.
It was Will Browning, the one they call Wilf the Beast. This bloke Wilf is like a bad nightmare. He's from South East London. He's crazy. He's always busy with a tool. It was him in Prague with a chisel.
Will Browning is a kickboxing instructor. He's regarded as Combat 18's top organiser in football and acts as Charlie Sargent's right-hand man. When earlier this year the police seized copies of Combat 18's latest magazine, it was from the homes of Charlie Sargent and Will Browning. In spite of the race-hate material contained in these magazines, neither Will Browning nor Charlie Sargent have been charged. While Mark Atkinson, Charlie Sargent and Will Browning continue to push their message in football, the violence they encourage spreads. 10 days ago in Halifax, Combat 18 made their most recent attack. This time on a group of school teachers.
It was comic relief. We'd all been eating Irish stew. It was St Patrick's Day. We'd been singing, having a really good time, and then all of a sudden the pub was full of skinheads and they all disappeared upstairs. It was quite weird. It was quite strange. And we went up to see what was happening.
One of them turned around and said, "We're Cockneys." And they were, and all their accents were very much from London, that shocked me. One of the men said, "Your ethnic friends are not welcome." To which point things started to get abusive. He started calling my friend a lesbian, to which we laughed, a very nervous laugh, but we did laugh because it sounded so ridiculous. And then one of them said to her, "I bet she's a Jew with that long nose, that big nose of hers."
They came out, so stood standing at the top of the stairs, said, "You Reds think we're just BNP teenagers that you can scare off. We ain't, we're C18 and you're dead." And then they hit us. A lot of punches landed on my head. I don't really remember what happened. My nose, my mouth, everything was bleeding. My friend jumped in to try and protect me, and basically I heard her nose crunch. It was horrible.
I got punched twice in the face. I got a broken nose. I don't remember the second punch. I was stunned. My glasses flew off, and I just remember this blind panic, this absolute panic, as 20 to 25 skinheads punched and kicked 8 of us down a flight of stairs.
The teachers had no idea of the identity of their assailants. We asked them both to look at some photographs. Amongst them were pictures of leading members of C18.
He was the one who told us he was Cockneys, and he's also the one that told us he was Combat 18. They were very proud of who they were. Oh God, yes. It's him. He's the one that assaulted me.
What do you feel looking at him?
Fear. It brings it all back. I'm shaking now. It brings the pain back. It brings back horrible thoughts, thoughts that I'd never thought I'd experience in my entire life. I never want to experience again.
The teachers identified their attackers as Charlie Sargent and Will Browning. Browning is a violent man motivated by racist politics. As a headhunter and as Combat 18's main organiser in football, Browning seeks to exploit violence on the terraces for his own political ends.
Combat 18 is a small group, but one with a disproportionate influence. If its activities are unchecked, then it could lead to serious problems within football.
Their influence among hooligan gangs, with all the potential for violence that entails, is causing concern among MPs.
Well, I asked the Home Secretary what evidence the government had of the involvement of Combat 18 with the activities of Chelsea supporters. He simply says, well, there is no evidence directly of Combat 18 involvement amongst Chelsea fans. Now, anybody who studies football and anybody who knows about what's been going on for a number of years in football knows very well that far-right groups have been very active in a number of clubs, and one of those clubs is Chelsea. And I get the impression that either the government doesn't want to tell us or they haven't got the information because they're out of touch, and that worries me.
I thought I was coping until I went back into work, because I've been suffering from a bit of agoraphobia since it happened. And just the jostling of school children and the noise and all the kids changing at bell time put me into a blind panic.
Are you going to help Mummy?
They're my jeans.
I have two children, and the older one, my 3-year-old, was very worried. Oh, Mummy, what happened to your face? You've got a poorly face. And at the time, my nose was much worse, as well as round my mouth. And I said, I thought about telling him I fell, and then I thought, no, tell him the truth. And I said, somebody hit Mummy. And he said, was it a monster?
We went to ask Mr. Browning how he could defend his attacks on football fans and innocent members of the public.
What justification can you have for that? What is your involvement with football? Please leave the camera alone. Don't touch that camera. Mr. Browning, Mr. Browning, please don't touch the camera. Were you also one of the ones responsible for the trouble in Dublin? Mr. Browning, please don't hit the camera. Do you think it's right that your magazine that you distribute, Mr. Browning, gloats about the attacks that have been made on innocent supporters? Yeah. Why do you think it's right that it gloats about attacks on innocent supporters, Mr. Browning? George, watch out! The man's got a screwdriver.
The Attorney General is considering prosecuting Browning for distribution of race-hate material. Our information on his involvement in the attack in Halifax has been requested by the police. 3 years after Combat 18 started its campaign...
You must commit them.
For 5 years, World in Action has investigated Britain's Nazi gangsters. They're vicious. They've even planned murder.
People came very close to getting killed by Combat 18 activists.
Tonight, the explosive secret at the heart of Britain's Nazis.
Now, the war is coming.
Their deeds are wicked, their image is ugly, and they are driven by ancient hatreds.
Thank you very much. Keep moving, folks.
For most of the 1990s, a fanatical band of thugs have tried to bring Hitler's ideas to the streets of Britain. They have committed crimes of intimidation, violence, arson, and murder. But they had their uses too. The security services infiltrated them, to find out about even more murderous fanatics in Northern Ireland. Tonight on World in Action, we have evidence that the leader of a gang of Nazi terrorists was a Special Branch informer. And we show how his work as an informer broke all the rules and left some of the targets of his racist gang unprotected. Meet Charlie Sargent. He likes to threaten people. He likes to attack people. For 5 years, he led a gang of thugs who wanted to bring Nazi ideas back to life.
Charlie Sargent's known as the Pig. He's a bit of an animal. He loves violence. He's a knife merchant. He loves knives. He'd stab anyone. He'd stab me or anybody he worked with. If you crossed Charlie Sargent or grasped, then Charlie Sargent would have you seen to. And if he was close enough, he'd do it himself. He gives out orders, recruits people. He's the man.
He had the support of quite a few heavyweights in the movement. And he used to, like, the fact that he knocked about with them gave him quite a lot of street cred, and people respected that, if not him.
The group he led was called Combat 18. Even its name was a homage to evil, the first and 8th letters of the alphabet, the initials of Adolf Hitler. And it was set up for one purpose.
Combat 18 had no political agenda. Combat 18 was just to deal with things on a violent level, to pay back time for us.
And with a vengeance, Combat 18 set about its business.
We have got your location and where you live, and we'll be watching you, and we're going to take you out. Just let her know that Combat 18 have got an eye on her. We're going to take her out.
Death threats, hit lists, gang attacks. Combat 18 declared war on its opponents and other races. And then Combat 18 sent out arson squads.
It set fire to the mat inside the doorway and started to ignite the wall there. Very fortunately, we had friends of the paper sleeping in the building at the time because we had just suffered a series of robberies. They found it almost immediately, extinguished it, and telephoned the fire brigade and the police.
One Combat 18 activist who was involved in these terror attacks has agreed to speak to us if we concealed his identity.
Charlie would put up the targets. He'd just come along and say, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? He'd say they were easy targets and would get lots of publicity for C18. But Charlie was never there. He'd stay well out of it. He'd say he was too high profile as leader to get involved. He just left it to us.
People came very close to getting killed by Combat 18 activists at the behest of Charlie Sargent.
Combat 18 was a reminder of some of the darkest urges in human nature. Their violence and extreme racism always made them a target for criminal investigation. But the police had another interest in them as well, because Combat 18 had friends in even darker places. In Northern Ireland, some of the most bestial attacks on innocent people have been at the hands of the Ulster Defence Association. For the UDA's gunmen, it's enough to mark you for attack that you went to the wrong school or worship in the wrong church. For the security services, penetrating the UDA was a major priority, but there were difficulties.
The UDA went through a leadership change in 1990, which meant that immediately there was a whole new set of people that the RUC would not have been aware of. They also broke down into a cell structure, which I think from their point of view, extremely wise thing to do. And I think it did make it very difficult for the RUC to have proper or the same level of intelligence that they previously would have had.
The new UDA leadership went on a sectarian killing spree. The security services were desperate for intelligence. One route into the UDA was through the Nazi hardmen of Combat 18. It had long been known that there were connections between the two organizations. Then, in 1993, police arrested 3 men transporting guns to Belfast. They were all UDA. But one of them, who'd driven the guns from London to Birmingham, was also a founder member of Combat 18. His name was Eddie Wicker.
You sell UDA magazines?
Yeah, no, I sell LPA magazines.
The Loyalist Prisoners Association,
That's right, yeah.
which was set up by the UDA.
Well, I don't know who it was set up by.
Yes, you do, Mr. Wicker. It was set up by the UDA, and you know it because you're a member of the UDA.
Well, what is there a law against that or something?
In fact, in Northern Ireland, there is. The UDA is banned because of its role in sectarian murders. Eddie Wicker was released when he convinced the Crown Prosecution Service that he didn't know what was in the bag. The other UDA men went to prison. But this hadn't been a one-off operation.
Those guns the police found in Birmingham were from C-18 members, but some of them had got through already. Probably a couple of dozen had already gone. And at the time Eddie got nicked, there was talk of a big consignment, worth thousands.
Not surprisingly, the Special Branch began to take a keener and keener interest in these links. A police officer who was involved in undercover work against Combat 18 has spoken to us anonymously.
At that time, the Special Branch were really interested in the Irish connection, or any connections to Ireland through Scotland. That would be 1994. There was a very, very intense interest in Ireland. They kept coming back. Anything else? Have you heard anything else?
But the same undercover officer was beginning to wonder about the leader of the group he was infiltrating.
There was obviously someone in the inner sanctum who was working for the police, deep, deep undercover. I would go to meetings where things were discussed, and as far as I knew, I was the only police officer there. Then I'd get a call. Can you confirm this? This was before I'd even put my own report in. Someone was getting intelligence out before I could. I worked out it had to be someone in the top 2 or 3. Then I concluded it could only be Sargent himself. With the requests for confirmation that were coming down, it had to be him.
Charlie Sargent had secretly become a way for Special Branch to keep tabs on loyalist gunmen in Northern Ireland. But all the while, his Combat 18 hit squads were up to no good on the mainland. And by now they were raising money for it. Combat 18's big earner was neo-Nazi rock music. They were making hundreds of thousands of pounds selling Nazi CDs all over Europe. The money was earmarked for very special purposes.
The reason that we've been so quiet lately is that we've been doing a lot of reorganising, mainly in the form of active service units.
It takes its name from the first and 8th letters of the alphabet, the initials of Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler.
And for those of you that have any doubts where the money's gone, it's gone on these. Now, the war is coming.
Some of the hardline militants of C18 wanted to take that approach, the hardline approach, and actually get out and do what people have been talking about for years.
And what was that?
Really get on some of the hardline stuff, real start hurting people, real make people take notice of us, move on to the next level.
Sorry, what does that mean, move on to the next level?
Up ourselves to a proper terrorist organisation.
Combat 18 wanted to make a splash, so they organised a letter bomb campaign against people they regarded as enemies. Some were obscure political opponents, but others were famous people who had done them no harm at all, but who had committed the crime of falling in love with someone from another race. One of their first bombs was addressed to the former swimming champion Sharon Davis.
Just 3 months ago, Sharon Davis and her partner, Olympic sprinter Derek Redmond, produced this little chap here, Elliot.
She had upset them by marrying black athlete Derek Redmond and having a mixed-race child.
It was to show that no matter how public or high profile you were, you could still get whacked. The letter bombs were to show that C18 weren't a bunch of mugs. We'd had it with being a drinking club. It was like drawing a line in the dirt. We've been talking about it all these years. Now we were doing it.
The bombs intercepted in January last year were intended to be the first of many. Other targets who had been on Combat 18's potential list included Frank Bruno and footballer Paul Ince. The letter bombs were the idea of this man, Charlie Sargent's right-hand man, Will Browning. He's a man with a ferocious reputation. The bomb maker was a Danish Combat 18 member and a devoted admirer of Browning. His name was Thomas Nakaber.
Thomas Nakaber was very well known here in Denmark since the late 80s, and he was twice member of the Nazi Party. Thomas was also one of the leading violent Nazis. He founded the Copenhagen division of Combat 18 because he wanted to fight in the streets.
He had never tried it before. It was his first bomb. Browning told him how to do it, and maybe he's made some investigations himself, but mainly he got the informations from Will Browning.
Thomas Nakaber built 3 bombs into video cassettes, but he didn't know that he was being watched. The Danish police had been tipped off by Scotland Yard.
The first information we got concerning this case we received from the British authorities, and based on that information we started surveying a Danish citizen, Thomas.
To cover his tracks, Thomas Nakaber caught the night ferry to Malmö in Sweden to post the letter bombs.
And we also followed him to Sweden, where we saw that he put 3 videotapes in a post box, and after having a look at them, it was clear that they did not contain videos, but they contained explosives and detonators.
The bombs were intercepted before they harmed anyone, but someone was damaged by this affair. It exposed Charlie Sargent as a police informer. Will Browning was already suspicious of Sargent, so when targets for the letter bombs were discussed, he laid a trap. Sargent was given the wrong names.
Targets were selected by an inner council of Combat 18. That council involved Charlie Sargent. Several names were discussed. Names that Sargent was given were not necessarily ones that were to be recipients. Sargent was privy to a list that wasn't the list that was used at the final posting.
It wasn't long before Browning's trap was sprung. When the letter bombs were discovered, the story broke in the British papers. They contained names of other people who were supposed to get letter bombs, but these names were from the false list which had been given to Charlie Sargent. At the same time, the post office circulated a warning from the police to sorting offices. It too contained names from the false list given to Charlie Sargent.
That was what finally finished Sargent as a Combat 18 member. That was what led to his expulsion. Sargent's list that he was aware of included names that were leaked to the press. Those names, by that stage, had been removed from any list.
So what conclusions did C-18 draw from that incident about the role of Charlie
Sargent must have been working with Special Branch. He must have been.
Will Browning now took over the leadership of Combat 18 and expelled Charlie Sargent. But Sargent wasn't going to take it lying down. Charlie Sargent wanted revenge. And some unfinished business gave him his chance. He still had things belonging to Combat 18, and Browning had things of his. A meeting was arranged, and a friend of Browning's, Chris Castle, went to Sargent's house to make the exchange. Browning stayed out of sight. Waiting with Sargent was an old friend and Nazi comrade, Martin Cross.
Sargent and Cross expected somebody to turn up on that morning acting on behalf of Will Browning. We knew from another witness who had actually been invited to be present that the plan was to attack whoever turned up to teach Will Browning a lesson.
When Chris Castle arrived at Sargent's house, he was set upon. As he tried to flee, he was stabbed in the back by Martin Cross, then chased and beaten by Sargent. He was dead by the time he got to hospital.
There is no doubt that Chris Castle was executed on that morning.
Sargent's arrest for murder finally confirmed what World in Action has also been told by a senior police officer, that Sargent had friends in high places. When he was arrested, he immediately demanded to be seen by Special Branch officers, and they came. The presence of these Scotland Yard officers at the station didn't go unnoticed. Will Browning was also under arrest at that stage, and when he was interviewed, his solicitor made sure that Special Branch's involvement was recorded.
I was told yesterday that there is intelligence about Mr. Browning in relation to this allegation of conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm. It's also told by an officer that there is Special Branch involvement. I know nothing of this intelligence, and I want to know why there is possible Special Branch involvement in this matter.
So, Special Branch officers were there, and at Sargent's request. But it did him no good. He was told that with a murder charge hanging over him, there was nothing they could do. Justice would have to take its course. And it did. Sargent and Cross were convicted and sent to prison for life. Informants have always been vital to the work of the police and the security services. But it has long been recognised that they have to be treated with great caution. So the police have guidelines regulating what they can and cannot do, and these guidelines are very clear.
The informant must not be the person who's putting forward the idea of indulging in some criminal activity. He must not be the planner. He should not be the person who's carrying out the action. Your informant, ideally, according to the code of practice, should be someone in a minor role, that is a lesser role, who's not involved in planning or in the actual execution.
Charlie Sargent drove a coach and horses through these guidelines. He committed crimes and he incited crimes, and they were serious crimes. Beatings and intimidation and firebombings were all carried out at his behest. The miracle is that only one person died.
Running informants is always going to be a dangerous issue, and I think it is quite hard to lay down clear guidelines that cover all cases. But there are some principles, and they are outlined in the Home Office guidelines, that really ought to be followed, and they would appear to have been breached in this case.
But it might all have been much, much worse. 3 years ago, Combat 18 was planning a new and serious terrorist campaign, and Charlie Sargent was at the heart of it. It was uncovered when police raided his deputy, Will Browning, in 1995.
It was a very significant find that the police made. Combat 18 at that stage were looking for a high-profile target to really put themselves on the map.
The police found bomb-making instructions. They found a sniper's manual. And they found that Combat 18 was targeting individuals for attack. Documents showed that at least 19 people had been targeted. 2 were already being watched. One of them was a World in Action journalist, Quentin McDermott.
Well, I was one of the journalists who, with other members of the World in Action team, helped to expose Combat 18 originally as a violent terrorist organisation. And indeed, at the end of the first film we made, Charlie Sargent made a threat to shoot one of our journalists.
Put it in your way, that's what's going to happen.
And so we all came out of that film knowing that there was, if you like, a general threat that there might be attempts at reprisals against us.
CIA team carried out a surveillance operation on that gentleman. That gentleman was in severe danger, and had it not been for those raids at that stage, I think that gentleman could well have been killed by Combat 18.
We went there several times, watching his movements. We were going to do it. We were up for it. People were planning to wait outside and shoot him through the window, or let him have one as he came out the door.
Amongst the documents the police seized from Browning's house was a page from an electoral register. On it, the address of Quentin McDermott's basement flat had been highlighted, and someone had written basement, number 52. World in Action had this document examined by a handwriting expert. The man who had pinpointed where Quentin McDermott lived was Charlie Sargent.
Charlie Sargent selected the World in Action reporter for Combat 18. Charlie Sargent was the one that came with a copy of the electoral roll and the specific descriptions of where in the apartments this reporter lived. That's all Charlie had to do. He put that into people's minds and left them with it.
And it was only the police raids that stopped this happening?
Without doubt. That attack on the World in Action reporter was at a very advanced stage, just prior to the raids on Combat 18 activists in early '95.
Will Browning was never charged with this murder plot. But even if there was not enough evidence to bring charges, surely the intended victims should have been warned by the police that they were in danger from Combat 18. But they weren't.
I received absolutely no warning whatsoever on that occasion from Special Branch or from the police. I feel that although investigative journalists have a duty, if you like, to take reasonable measures to protect themselves, we are, after all, at the end of the day, members of the public, and we are entitled to the same level of protection as ordinary members of the public. And I believe that the police should have alerted me to the threat.
Potential targets have the right, in my view, to be informed by the police if the police are in possession of information which means that those potential targets are at risk. If the police have that information, then it seems to me it's not only justice but fairness that the police should pass the information on to the targets so that they can take perhaps the most elementary precautions to avoid risk to themselves or their premises.
And it wasn't as if the police could be sure that their raid on Browning had removed the threat of attack. Only 2 weeks later, Combat 18 firebombed the home of a political opponent in Kent.
Charlie wanted her torched, you know, done. He was going on and on about her ages before the police raided us. It was all set in motion before the raids, and even after the raids had happened, it still went ahead, and he knew it was still going ahead.
My son was out on the landing and he was shouting that the house is on fire. And as I came out the bedroom, you could see it was there was smoke everywhere, and you could see flames reflected. We had smoke alarms fitted, and a lot of other precautions that we took made sure the inner door was shut, because if on the night of the firebombing, whoever it was that sprayed the petrol through, if we hadn't have had smoke alarms, if we hadn't had that door shut, then it would have just come straight up the stairs, and well, we wouldn't have stood a chance. It's a really small terraced house, and you know, we would have all been dead.
Well, if there was a good reason for not informing Mr. McDermott when the police initially became aware of the threat to him, perhaps because it would have tipped off the aggressors, those reasons disappeared with the firebombing 2 weeks later of a woman in Kent. And it ought to have been clear to everyone from that point onwards that despite the police raid, Combat 18 was still capable of mounting potentially lethal attacks.
We've traced 10 of the people targeted by Combat 18 on the papers found in the raid on Browning. Not one of them was warned by the police. The question now is what Scotland Yard will do with our evidence. Clearly, Charlie Sargent did help them to foil the Danish letter bomb campaign. Against that, he ran a ruthless campaign of terror. He plotted murder. Finally, he did murder. But could he have been arrested earlier? And how did Scotland Yard reward him? Our evidence suggests that when they forged an alliance with a man like Charlie Sargent, Scotland Yard were playing with fire.